Whispers of the Orchard, Chapter 1, The Flower Shop. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Fleur d'Elodie, bathing the quaint flower shop in a soft golden light. The smell of freshly cut roses mingled with lavender and peonies, enveloping Elodie Renaud in the familiar comforting sense of her family's legacy. Her fingers deftly arranged a bouquet of deep red roses and white lilies, each stem handled with the utmost care. Elodie had long ago mastered the art of floristry, but even after years of tending to flowers, she found solace in the act of creation. She glanced at the large wooden sign above the counter, Fleur d'Elodie, established 1879. Her family had owned the shop for 3 generations, her mother having passed it down to her. It wasn't just a business, it was her safe haven, the place where she could immerse herself in beauty and forget the pain that had lodged itself in her heart after the war had taken Adrien. It had been 2 long years since Adrien, her fiancé, had gone off to fight and never returned. Elodie had tried to grieve, to move forward, but she'd found herself retreating deeper into the rhythms of her flower shop. The vibrant blooms became her companions, their ephemeral beauty a reminder of the fragility of life. She had poured all her love and energy into the shop, keeping the outside world at arm's length. The soft jingle of the shop bell interrupted her thoughts. Elodie looked up and immediately tensed. Standing in the doorway was Marcel Laurent, the wealthiest man in the village and the owner of the sprawling Laurent orchards. His sharp features were softened by his expertly tailored suit, and his eyes glimmered with an intensity that set her on edge. "Good morning, Elodie," Marcel said, stepping into the shop with his usual air of entitlement. "The flowers look lovely today, though not as lovely as you." Elodie forced a polite smile, already anticipating what was coming. Marcel's visits had become more frequent, and they had little to do with a genuine appreciation for flowers. She suspected he wasn't truly interested in her either, not in a romantic sense at least. His intentions were far more calculating. "Thank you, Marcel," she replied, her voice measured as she continued arranging the bouquet. "How can I help you today?" Marcel moved closer, eyeing the arrangements with a nonchalant gaze. "I was passing by and thought I'd drop in to see if you'd given my offer any more thought." Elodie's hands froze for a moment and she drew in a quiet breath. The offer. He meant the thinly veiled threat to buy her flower shop and incorporate the land into his orchard empire. "I haven't changed my mind," Elodie said evenly, meeting his gaze. "The shop is not for sale." Marcel's smile tightened, but he didn't lose his cool. He leaned casually against the counter, his fingers tapping lightly on the polished wood. "Elodie, you're a smart woman. Surely you understand that it's only a matter of time before this village changes. Expanding the orchard would benefit everyone. Jobs, prosperity. Think of what we could build together." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she remained outwardly calm. "My family has owned this shop for over 40 years. It's not about money, it's about legacy. I'm not selling." For a brief moment, something dark flickered in Marcel's eyes, a flash of impatience beneath his charming facade. He pushed himself off the counter, adjusting his cuffs with a deliberate grace. "I admire your tenacity," he said smoothly, "but just remember, Elodie, change is inevitable. You might find it easier to adapt now rather than later." Without waiting for a response, Marcel tipped his hat and left the shop, the bell jingling as the door swung shut behind him. Elodie exhaled, her pulse racing. She knew Marcel wouldn't give up. His persistence was relentless, and she feared what he might do if he felt cornered. The village had already started to shift under his influence. He owned most of the land surrounding the village and had recently bought out the small bakery down the road. But she refused to let him have her shop. It was all she had left. In need of a moment to clear her mind, Elodie removed her apron and stepped outside. The familiar path that wound through the orchards beckoned to her, and soon she found herself walking among the rows of apple trees, the cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves. The orchards had always been a place of peace for her, a reminder that the world continued to grow and change despite the heartache that lingered. As she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with a man carrying a heavy basket of apples. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Elodie exclaimed, stepping back quickly. The man looked up, startled for a moment, before offering her a warm smile. His amber eyes caught the light of the late afternoon sun, and there was something in his gaze, gentleness perhaps, that set him apart from the other workers in the orchard. He set the basket down and wiped his brow. "No harm done, mademoiselle," he said in a soft, gravelly voice. "I should have been paying more attention." Elodie smiled back, recognizing him now. "You work for Marcel, don't you? Luc Delaunay?" He nodded. "That's right. I've seen you around here before. Fleur d'Elodie, isn't it? I hear you're quite the florist." She shrugged modestly, glancing down at the apples in his basket. "I do my best. The flowers are what keep me grounded." Luc chuckled softly. "I can understand that. These trees have a way of calming the mind. I find peace in the work." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of the orchard filling the quiet between them. The distant hum of the village was muffled by the vast expanse of trees, and Elodie felt a strange comfort in Luc's presence. He seemed different from the other men who worked for Marcel, less hardened, more thoughtful. "I should let you get back to your work," Elodie said finally, though she felt an odd reluctance to leave. Luc nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. "Of course, but if you ever want to talk, well, I'm often in the orchards. It's a good place to clear your head." Elodie smiled again, a small, grateful smile, before turning to walk back toward the village. As she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just encountered someone important, someone who, like her, understood the delicate balance between holding on to the past and navigating the changing world around them. Chapter 2. Stolen Glances. In the days that followed, Elodie found herself drawn back to the orchards more often than usual. Each time she hoped to catch a glimpse of Luc. There was something unspoken between them, an ease that she had not felt with anyone in a long time. It wasn't romance, not yet, but there was a quiet understanding in the way they spoke, as if they both recognized the weight of the burdens they carried. Their encounters were brief, each one leaving Elodie with a curious lightness in her chest. She found herself lingering in the orchards longer than necessary, taking in the sight of the sun, filtering through the apple trees and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. And more often than not, Luc was there too, tending to the trees with a quiet reverence. One afternoon, as she made her way along the familiar path, she saw him standing beneath one of the larger apple trees, his shirt sleeves rolled up as he reached for a particularly high branch. She hesitated, watching him work, admiring the ease with which he moved. There was a grace to him, an unspoken connection to the land that reminded her of how she felt when tending to her flowers. Luc noticed her approach and smiled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Back again, mademoiselle?" Elodie returned the smile, though her heart skipped a beat. "It seems I can't stay away from the orchards." "Or from me, it seems," Luc teased gently, his amber eyes glinting with humor. She blushed at the playful remark, but there was no malice in his words, only warmth. "You seem to always be here when I come by." He shrugged. "I spend most of my days here. It's where I belong, I think." Elodie paused for a moment, contemplating his words. "Do you really enjoy working for Marcel?" Luc's smile faded slightly, and for the first time she saw a shadow pass over his features. He leaned against the tree, his gaze distant. "It's complicated. Marcel's given me steady work, and I'm grateful for that, but I don't always agree with how he runs things." Elodie nodded, understanding more than she could express. She had felt the same unease around Marcel for months now, the sense that he wanted more than just land, that he wanted control over everything in the village. It made her uneasy to think that Luc worked for him, though she sensed that Luc didn't share Marcel's ambitions. Sometimes I feel like Marcel's trying to take over everything, she said quietly, her eyes drifting toward the manor that loomed in the distance. He's been pressuring me to sell the shop. Luke's gaze snapped back to hers, his expression serious. And will you? No, Elodie replied firmly. I can't. That shop is all I have left of my family. Luke nodded slowly, his eyes softening. I understand. Family legacies are important. I'd hate to see you lose that. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. Elodie could feel the warmth of Luke's presence, the quiet strength in his words, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. Chapter 3. Conflicted Hearts. Days turned into weeks, and Elodie found herself spending more and more time in the orchards. Her walks with Luke became a regular occurrence, their conversations growing deeper with each passing day. They talked about the village, the changing world, and their shared frustrations with Marcel's growing influence. Luke never openly criticized his employer, but Elodie could sense his growing discomfort. One afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the orchard, Luke opened up about his own struggles. I've worked for Marcel for years, Luke said, his voice low as they strolled beneath the apple trees. At first it was just a job. I needed the money, and the orchard offered steady work. But lately, he trailed off, his gaze distant, and Elodie waited patiently for him to continue. Lately it's felt different, Luke said finally. Marcel's ambitions are bigger than just running an orchard. He wants control over the land, over the village, over people, and I'm not sure I can be part of that anymore. Elodie nodded, her heart aching for him. She understood all too well the pressure of being caught between loyalty and conscience. Marcel's grip on the village was tightening, and Luke, like many others, was struggling to find his place in the changing world. Have you thought about leaving? She asked gently, her eyes searching his face. Luke hesitated, his expression conflicted. I have, he admitted, but where would I go? Work isn't easy to come by these days, and I have to make a living somehow. Elodie's heart sank at his words. She knew that Luke was trapped, just as she was, by circumstances beyond his control. And yet, as much as she sympathized with him, she couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her. Luke worked for Marcel, the man who wanted to take her shop, her family's legacy. Could she really trust him? Luke, she began cautiously, I need to ask you something. He turned to her, his expression open and earnest. Anything. Do you think Marcel might use you to get to me? Luke blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. What do you mean? I mean, Elodie said slowly, do you think Marcel might ask you to spy on me, to report back to him about what I'm doing? Luke's eyes widened in shock, and he shook his head vehemently. Elodie, I would never do that. I swear I'm not working for Marcel to hurt you. I care about you, more than you know. The sincerity in his voice, the way his amber eyes locked onto hers, made her breath catch in her throat. She wanted to believe him, desperately. But the walls she had built around her heart after losing Adrian were hard to tear down. I'm sorry, she whispered, looking away. I don't know who to trust anymore. Luke reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You can trust me, Elodie. I promise you that. For a long moment they stood there in the quiet of the orchard, her hand in his, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. And in that moment Elodie felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a fragile hope, a tentative spark of trust. Chapter 4. Luke's Realization. That evening, long after Elodie had returned to her flower shop, Luke found himself standing alone in the orchard, staring up at the stars. The air was crisp and cool, and the scent of ripe apples filled the night. But Luke's mind was far from the peaceful setting around him. Instead, it was filled with thoughts of Elodie, her kind smile, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her flowers, the quiet strength she carried despite the pressures surrounding her. In that moment, Luc realized something that had been building inside him for weeks now. He was in love with Elodie Renard. It wasn't just her beauty, though, that was undeniable. It was the way she saw the world, the way she cherished the things that mattered most, her family, her shop, her memories. She reminded him of the orchards themselves, strong, resilient, and deeply rooted in the land, and he wanted nothing more than to be a part of that world. But there was one thing standing in the way: his job with Marcel. Luc knew that if he wanted to be with Elodie, he couldn't continue working for the man who was trying to take her livelihood. It wasn't just about the orchard anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and for the woman he loved. The decision was clear. He would quit working for Marcel no matter the cost, and if Elodie would have him, he would help her in the flower shop, building something beautiful together. Chapter 5. A Confession. The next morning, Luc arrived at the flower shop just as Elodie was opening up for the day. The familiar scent of roses and lavender greeted him as he stepped inside, but today the shop felt different, warmer, more inviting. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that today he would lay his heart bare. "Luc," Elodie said, looking up from a vase of wildflowers, "you're here early." "I needed to talk to you," Luc said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "There's something I need to tell you." Elodie set the vase down, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Luc took a deep breath, stepping closer. "Elodie, I'm leaving Marcel's orchard. I can't work for him anymore, not when I see what he's trying to do to you, to this village. I don't care about the money or the job. All I care about is you." Elodie's eyes widened in surprise, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "I love you, Elodie," Luc continued, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I've loved you for weeks now, but I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid that my connection to Marcel would make you push me away, but I can't keep hiding how I feel. I want to help you, in the shop, in your life, however you'll have me." For a long, agonizing moment, Elodie was silent. Luc's heart pounded in his chest, the fear of rejection tightening his throat. But then, slowly, a smile began to tug at the corners of Elodie's lips. You love me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luc nodded, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "With everything I have." Elodie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing as she stepped closer to him. "Luc, I don't know what to say. I've been so afraid of letting someone in after everything that's happened, but you've shown me nothing but kindness, and I think I might love you too." Luc's heart soared at her words, and before he could stop himself, he reached out and pulled her into his arms. Elodie didn't resist. Instead, she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest as they stood there in the middle of the flower shop, wrapped in each other's warmth. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elodie felt safe. Chapter 6. Marcel's Ultimatum. But their happiness was short-lived. The next day, Marcel arrived at the shop with a letter in hand, his face twisted into a cold smile. He strode inside without so much as a greeting, his eyes scanning the room as if he were already claiming it for himself. "Good morning, Elodie," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I hope you're well." Elodie tensed, already sensing that something was wrong. "What do you want, Marcel?" Marcel's smile widened as he handed her the letter. "This is a legal notice. If you don't sell the shop to me by the end of the month, I'll take you to court. And trust me, Elodie, I'll win." Elodie's blood ran cold as she read the letter, her hands shaking. This was worse than she had imagined. Marcel wasn't just trying to buy the shop, he was threatening to take it by force. "You can't do this," Elodie whispered, her voice barely steady. "Oh, I can," Marcel replied smugly, "and I will." Before Elodie could respond, Luc stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "No, you won't." Marcel's gaze shifted to Luc, his smile faltering. "What did you just say?" "I said, you won't take this shop," Luc repeated, his voice steady. "I'm done working for you, Marcel. I won't stand by and let you destroy everything good in this village." Marcel's face twisted with rage, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk away from me, Delaunay? You'll regret this, both of you." He stormed out of the shop, slamming the door behind him. Elodie stood frozen, the letter still in her hands, but Luc was there beside her in an instant, pulling her into his arms. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "We'll fight this, together." And in that moment, Elodie knew that they would. Chapter 7. Standing Together. Marcel didn't make good on his threats immediately, but his presence loomed over the village like a storm cloud. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of legal battles and shady deals, and Elodie found herself bracing for the worst. But through it all, Luc was by her side, his steady presence giving her the strength she needed to keep going. The villagers, too, began to rally behind her. Many of them had seen what Marcel was doing, how he was buying up land and businesses, slowly tightening his grip on the village, and they weren't willing to let him take Fleur d'Elodie without a fight. In the weeks that followed, Elodie and Luc worked tirelessly to gather support. They held meetings with other shop owners, spoke with the village council, and even reached out to old family friends for help. The tide was turning in their favor, and Marcel knew it. One evening, as the sun was setting over the orchard, Marcel arrived at the shop for what would be the final time. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. "You've made a mistake, Elodie," he snarled. "This village will be mine, one way or another." Elodie met his gaze, unflinching. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Marcel's lips curled into a sneer, but before he could respond, Luc stepped forward, his arm around Elodie's shoulders. "You've lost, Marcel. It's over." And with that, Marcel turned and walked away, defeated. Chapter 8. A Love Renewed. That night, after the dust had settled, Elodie and Luc sat together in the shop, the soft glow of candlelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elodie allowed herself to breathe, to feel the warmth of Luc's presence beside her. "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was afraid to love again. After Adrien, I didn't think I could." Luc took her hand in his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past slowly lifting from Elodie's heart. Then, with a soft smile, she leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that was sweet and tender, and filled with the promise of everything they could build together. Chapter 9. Blooming Futures. The next morning the shop was filled with the scent of fresh flowers. Luc had begun working there alongside Elodie, using his knowledge of the land to help the business thrive. Together they worked side by side, arranging flowers for a village wedding, a symbol of new beginnings. As they walked through the orchard later that day, hand in hand, the sunlight filtering through the trees, Elodie felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. Luc squeezed her hand, and she looked up at him, smiling. "I think this is just the beginning," she said softly. Luc smiled back, his eyes filled with warmth. "It is, and we'll face whatever comes next together." As they walked, the orchard around them burst into bloom, a sea of flowers swaying gently in the breeze, a testament to the love they had found and the life they would build. The end. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Want to be the first to catch new releases? Hit the bell to stay updated. Thank you for listening.